Welcome to Matrix Tech Talk.
In this episode, Eve Mailer talks about what privacy lessons automotive industry should learn from internet data sharing. In today's episode, we have the XmlGirl, aka Eve Mailer. Eve Mailer is the co-inventor of XML, co-inventor of SAML, the cross-domain single sign-on protocol. She is known as the XmlGirl, Queen of Ven of Identity, and she's the chief humanitarian. Eve is currently driving the privacy and the consent innovation of ForgeRock. Eve, welcome to Matrix virtually.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Hassan. It's been a long time since we've gotten to work together in standards, but I am passionate about standards. I'm passionate about creating wide ecosystems that function for everybody, whether it's people, whether it's service operators, whether it's companies that are making devices, and especially in these environments these days, connected cars, autonomous vehicles of all sorts. And that's something that my company is actually working a lot with these days. So privacy and consent are very important in these contexts as personal data is being flung across domains with increasing rapidity and volume. So that's what I'm doing these days.
Sounds fascinating. So Eve, let's begin with the question, as you mentioned, privacy and consent. So we have seen from the internet domain, from social media, and many incidences like this. If we go back 10 years ago in European Identity Conference, when I heard your talk for the first time, the things that you were predicting came true in some of the recent incidences, right? And today we're talking about autonomous vehicle, and all that sort of a thing is going to raise more privacy issues. So what's your take on that? Can you tell us how do you see the future developing?
Absolutely. So, increasingly vehicles and devices of all sorts are acting on behalf of us, hopefully with some instruction from us, but increasingly they are gathering our personal data, they are generating personal data about us, and they are acting supposedly for our benefit. Interestingly, there is an organization in Europe called FIA Region 1 that has done a study, actually a series of studies. One of them is a legal study called My Car, My Data. And they were trying to establish, well, how much data surrounding some sort of connected car it counts as personal data in terms of things like the General Data Protection Regulation, the famous GDPR, which is the new data privacy regulation that's in force right now. And what they discovered is that almost all the data associated with such a vehicle counts as personal data. Even things like, how much oil is in the vehicle right now. And you think, well, that doesn't sound very personal, doesn't sound very private or anything. But it's determined that that counts as personal data because there's a registered owner of the vehicle. So if you've got an API attached to such a vehicle and you want to test, well, what are the oil levels right now? You have to protect that data as if it's personal because it turns out legally it is. So everything surrounding any kind of vehicle these days that's got a net connection, if you will, has got to be protected, has got to be treated as kind of extra sensitive. So that's one consequence of this modern era, is that data protection has to be taken super seriously. Another consequence is that we've got super duper opportunities to do exciting things for people who want to take advantage of autonomous vehicles. If they want to be driven around in comfort and do other things while they take advantage of something, a vehicle that's doing something for them, well, let's say a person is taking advantage of the circumstance and they are not the owner of the vehicle. They have been loaned or they are renting this vehicle from somebody else. How did that sharing happen? Has a payment instrument been attached to this vehicle by the owner so that they can be taken through tolls? They can ride along a smart city enabled smart road. They can park in a parking facility that's been smart enabled. These are things that are real life now in a lot of circumstances. What if somebody who's not the owner of the vehicle is now being driven around? How do these circumstances work? Personal data is rife throughout this very wide ecosystem. So one of the things that my colleagues and I are working on is to figure out how to do this right, how to make sure the personal data flows, how to make sure it's protected correctly, but also how to ensure that people get a positive say in what happens with their data and where it flows and how the devices are controlled correctly as well.
Mm.
So there are opportunities for data protection throughout the wide ecosystem. There are also opportunities for positive data sharing on the part of owners of vehicles, as well as data sharing to others, and even sharing of vehicles with others and sharing of devices with others. And that kind of counts as data sharing as well.
Another term we use, personally identifiable data and personal data. What is the difference between personally identifiable data and personal data?
So the General Data Protection Regulation uses the phrase personal data and defines it fairly broadly. The term of art PII, personally identifiable data, is usually meant to be a kind of subset of personal data, meaning that it is identifying a specific person in the real world all by itself, with not necessarily a need to use other pieces of data in correlation with it to sort of triangulate on a person. So for example, in my world of digital identity, you'll have an identity record that's referenced when you log in, say, to your account, an online account, or through a mobile app or through a web portal, something like that. And through that, you're logging in to a system that has a record with a unique key into that record. And so that unique key, and there may be multiple, will count very strongly as personally identifiable data, personally identifiable information. And lots of information about a person is personally identifiable. A broader set of information is personal data, and lots of things can count. As I said, personal data can be, the amount of oil in your car.
Mm-hmm. So the amount of oil in your car, will that be personally identifiable data? So personally identifiable data, this would mean, as you said, you would be able to track the individual behind the data. And personal data would something that relates to a person.
It's unlikely that the oil level in your car is personally identifiable, but it's shown that the pattern of wear on your tires can become personally identifiable, and like the way that your tires have pressure over time as you drive can almost be a biometric in and of itself, a biometric authenticator of you. So quite a lot of how somebody drives a car or how a car operates, if you're somehow giving it instructions, if it's autonomous, can become personally identifiable. And this is something that's it becomes quite sensitive when you look at the broader ecosystem of how data is being gathered about you in the larger picture. So for example, as you make your way about town or in the country and you are going to an appointment with a doctor, depending on how much the car ecosystem writ large knows about you and the endpoint that you're going to, you're traversing real geography. If the car ecosystem and the map ecosystem, even the music ecosystem, the mechanic ecosystem, all these things are really service ecosystems that, collect data points about you. And of course, we know that data is being sold about you so that you can be marketed to. All those things contribute to a kind of fingerprint about you. And that's where the sensitivity really comes in. And that's why we see regulations being kind of a rising tide. It's not just GDPR. The US is now considering regulations. Individual states in the US, many countries around the world are actually considering or building GDPR-inspired or style regulations.
You talked about several use cases. Car sharing is one, and when it comes to autonomous vehicle, then your car will not only something that takes you from point one to point A to point B. You will be probably logging into your social network, your business network, and many other things. Your music. You will be using that vehicle as your mobile office, maybe. That would open up innovation. At the same time, that would raise some privacy issues, some security issues. So, where do you see in which scenario do you see the major threats in the coming years?
Well, there's many threats. I mean, one of the threats, of course, is personal safety. A car, really any vehicle, has a net connection. It can be hacked. It almost goes without saying these days that anything is net connected, it can be hacked. I hope everybody knows that. And if a person is associated with a vehicle, and I mean in the moment, in the vehicle being taken somewhere, there's a concept that my company ForgeRock has helped promulgate with a number of other companies called identity relationship management. So your grandfather's identity and access management, for sort of employee populations, was really about a kind of static view of the universe. You have hierarchies that are expressed in org charts, and you could do access management in a sort of static fashion. But now, when you look at consumer populations that you have to manage identity for, and then all the things that they interact with, whether it's fitness wearables, cars, now you get into smart city where you've got sensors in roadways and bridges that your cars are interacting with, you're interacting with cars. You have to build quite dynamically relationships with those things, and then tear down relationships with those things at the appropriate moment as well. Those relationships are not like the role management of old and the privilege management of old. It must be much more dynamic. And the data that's flowing across those has to be more dynamically associatable as well and disassociatable as well. And so when you think about the threat scenarios, oh my goodness, I mean, you had better be able to disassociate timely, or you could have somebody being tracked through a vehicle inappropriately that has now moved on to being shared with somebody else. I mean, people have already discovered, when they connect their music source to an Uber or a Lyft that they're in, or maybe a car that they've rented actually is more realistic, where they've shared their playlist with the car, and then their playlist is kind of associated forevermore, or their favorite radio stations with a rental car. You want to be able to associate that, and that's not a very high risk scenario, but it could become high risk if the car's whereabouts are tracked thereafter, and it comes and finds you where you've been later. We need to start disassociating timely when the person is no longer associated with a device, that is to say, a car that is not theirs. Similarly to Airbnb situations, where you've merely stayed a few nights in a place. What if somebody's coming and looking for you and they've tracked where you've been? We need to start disassociating, unpairing people with devices they've had any association with. So identity relationship management, IRM, is a critical component of not just privacy, but security in not just the future, not just the near future, but today, because consumers get to choose what they associate with. We can't make them do things the way we can make employees do things.
You mentioned several stimulating points. One is personal safety.
Yes.
And dissociation of data. Let's start with personal safety. What exactly is meant by personal safety when you say personal safety? What kind of risk do you see there?
I mean physical safety in this case. Of course, I mean data as well. But when we're talking vehicles, we're talking the Internet of Things. Mm-hmm. And it's a particularly complex ecosystem in the Internet of Things picture, because a vehicle is a rolling ecosystem. It's a very large device that's made up of many, many smaller devices and could be, many thousands of sensors. The way I think of things, being an identity person, is every one of these has a unique identity and needs to be tracked. And their association with each other as a rolling ecosystem tends to be fairly persistent. I mean, if you look at an airplane that's been assembled to have, a lifetime of decades, okay, that's really persistent. A car may not be many, many decades, but it's a long time. But the association with a person that interacts with it, okay, an owner, maybe it's a decade, or I don't know what, maybe it's 4 years or 2 years now, I don't know. But if they loan the car to somebody or let a mechanic work on it, you want to be able to audit and track what that mechanic did to what parts and what sensors in case something untoward happens. And then when it's returned to the person who owns it, who's the owner of record, you want to be able to know that what the mechanic did. I mean, the mechanic is a person also with an identity in that guise, in that role. You want to be able to know that the personal safety of anybody who operates it thereafter, including the owner, including whoever they share it with, is assured. So it's about auditable proof of what happened. It's also about consent to have given permission to let that vehicle, that assemblage of things with identities, move on to that other context. So this is why I talk about IRM, identity relationship management, because if we don't start seeing it that way, the data involved may be at risk. But these rolling things, obviously we've seen, people die already when these things are starting to make, autonomous or semi-autonomous decisions.
All right, so I'm going back to the scenarios you mentioned, the technological advancement, the positive data sharing scenarios you mentioned, and let's boil it down to a very simple one. I'm going to play the devil's advocate here and ask you, so when I share my data, my GPS data, it's a very simple scenario that we're doing today. When I share my GPS data, I get the advantage of traffic information, and that saves my time. I'm being benefited. Yeah. Where do you see the problem in such scenario, and where do you see the privacy threat?
Right. So, we're sort of in the second of three eras. The first era in, broadly connected car, if you will, was the offline era. And the offline era for me was all the cars that went up just before we started having a jack into which you could plug a smartphone. Mm-hmm. So even once we started getting the internet and we started getting the web, cars were still offline much longer than we were online, right? You'd go to MapQuest and you'd print out your directions and then you'd go turn by turn and you could be anonymous on MapQuest, right? When you went and printed out the directions. And then we entered the connected era, and we're in the connected era now. Many, many cars that are sold, I think, most of them at least have a SIM card and they're net connected. And what that means is you typically will be, you'll have that association with the car that I was talking about. You'll be paired with your car. And you are leveraging you're leveraging a location cloud. So, if I go into my car and I connect with either the GPS system in the car, or I might be connected with Waze or something like that on my phone, and my phone is now paired with the car, and you've got that association that's been made, you're obviously benefiting. You're sharing who you are, and you're sharing the location you want to go to, and you're getting the benefit of a really huge location cloud for free as far as you can tell. You're not paying money for it, and you're getting a service. It's awesome, but nothing is ever free. We pay for all these services in one or more of three ways. We pay in money, or we pay in attention, ads, or we pay in data directly. And so in the case of Waze, we're paying in data and we're paying in attention. I mean, we're giving data and we're paying in attention because there's ads that pop up, right? So it's not that it's inherently bad, it's that it may be a sort of devil's choice. What do we do when we're not entirely informed about what we gave up when we paid in those other two ways? No pun intended with the Waze service, which I use and I love. But I think about it twice and I turn it off. I turn off all the tracking every time I'm finished using it, every time. And the reason that it's a challenge of a choice for people now, and people are starting to become more savvy and aware and cynical about it. They see headlines about breaches. They see headlines about, can we trust some of these certain companies? Is that they know they're being marketed to, and it's not just random billboards along the side of the road, which are not targeting you specifically as an individual, speaking of PII. Those random billboards can only target whoever happens to drive by. They know roughly where you are, unless they have a beacon in them. Mm-hmm. But those ads are targeting you really, really precisely. And it's known that when they do that, they can target you so precisely that malicious parties can know enough about you to effectively game you in really harmful ways. And, there's some terrible things that have been done testing what you can do with Facebook ads and targeting, for example, that, can find out who you are, certain proclivities that you have, certain populations, micropopulations, and harm you. So that's one of the really downsides of targeted marketing.
The way I see targeted marketing or targeted ads is, to me, it's democratization of entrepreneurship, at the same time democratization of consumer choices. Because without targeting, what the consumers had only 3 choices from those big brands who could afford to put their ads in CNN. So now I have more choices. I'm being targeted. Yes, the word target sounds negative, but it's personalized for me. So I'm getting things that I would like to see. With all these things, I think you can look at it as a privilege or as a threat. So what's your take on that?
Yeah, I think that part of the challenge has been, I'm not gainsaying what you're saying. Actually, I think you're right that there are benefits to being able to be marketed to in a way that gets you stuff that you might like. So it's not inherently bad, as I say. The challenge has been creepy factors and the potential for harm done to micropopulations. So there's a real malicious play to be had there. And what we're now seeing as a response, there's kind of a very interactive dynamic between market pressures, consumer unhappiness with these situations, and regulatory forces. So in other words, governments picking up on consumer unhappiness, and consumer unhappiness feeding on the government pressures that they see, the government forces that are happening, such that we're seeing these regulatory actions taking place. So I mentioned GDPR already. And Brazil is taking action, India is taking action, Australia is taking action with a thing called the consumer data right. Canada is taking further action. Even the US, I say even the US because of its markedly business-friendly environment, is looking at taking action because of the consumer unhappiness about all of the many headlines that have been in the news about not just data breaches, but deliberate actions being taken by companies that have a business model to make you pay not in money, but in data and attention. And people are unhappy enough, they feel like they've been hoodwinked enough that governments have said, you know what, we're going to make this not optional. Something has to change. And as much as I, personally, I'm not happy with going to the well really often and first around regulation, I am sympathetic with going to the well at some point around these regulations at this point. And with GDPR, what they've done in this case is partly to ensure a digital single market, what they call a digital single market across the EU. That is to say, remove barriers to cross EU country participation, to smooth the way, make it less full of friction to do business in the EU, to make sure that it's that the same regulations apply in each country as much as possible. And the U.S. is thinking about the same thing, I think, across the states. So it's to help businesses innovate faster as well as to help protect people's interests.
You have mentioned what is already happening. What's already happening in the privacy sphere? What other dimension do you think it's going to add when we'll have such scenarios?
Well, I see just so much upside there, actually. And I just see that we have some of the technology pieces that enable that future. We probably need a little bit more of what my fellow humanitarians and I call the BLT sandwich. And what we mean by that is not just bacon, lettuce, and tomato, which is a lovely sandwich, but business, legal, and technical frameworks. The technology that I know and love, I founded the standards effort for, is user-managed access, UMA, which I know you're well aware of. Hope to introduce the audience to this. It's an OAuth-based technology. OAuth is used the world over to secure APIs and help people consent to the connection of an application to a service. This is used frequently also for IoT. And what user-managed access, UMA, does is help people proactively share access to whatever resource, could be a connected car, an autonomous vehicle, with other third parties. So very much an Alice sharing with Bob or Alice sharing with an entirely other company, a vehicle, an apartment, a collection of resources that might all be smart devices in one way, shape, or another, with another party. So technology exists to enable this to happen. And we have many individual device sharing, car sharing, apartment sharing services. What we haven't yet seen is a way to make this easier and to see it in a context of consent and permissions. And, you know, we've just started to see an inkling with things like smart contracts. You know, smart contracts can enable a much more regularized, automated way of helping people do this for their own benefit. Because I think you're right, you know, the sharing economy is, there's so much upside to it. It's about granting people permission to get access to your stuff. And I think we're just on the cusp of people having a lot more interesting stuff that they can grant people access to. And we just recently saw General Motors announce that they're shutting down plants that make sedans, old-fashioned sedans. Now, some other sedans still seem to be popular to make, but you know, maybe that's a harbinger for the future of maybe not buying so many, at least traditional cars. But if that means sharing the vehicles that we do have and making better use of them, well, I'm all in favor of that. Let's grant people access, carefully curated and secured access to the stuff we have, and make money off of it. Those are some great use cases. So I see UMA as technology that enables doing that. I also see this identity relationship management concept and technology underlying it. The typical technology underlying IRM is graph database technology to enable that kind of positive data sharing vision, so that we can get where I think we really need to go, so that we can protect personal data and get out of all these cool devices and systems what we want to get out of it. So some problems that I see if we go down the path that we're going now are that we've got so many devices and so many sensors involved in not just the vehicles that we're talking about, but the infrastructure that they need to connect to. So when we look at vehicle-to-vehicle communications, vehicle-to infrastructure communications, you know, I've talked about parking structures and smart roads, smart city, all the way around, and vehicle-to-cloud communications. We're talking an increasing number of unique identities that need to communicate. And of course, we're talking about communications that are rife with personal data. Again, personal data being flung around all of these networks. It's a little bit terrifying to me as a privacy person. And we're talking about a lot of companies that are trying to innovate around these solutions, and they may possibly be regulated to death if they try. You know, just imagining a use case of one of the things we've been seeing a use case plumbed in Europe a lot, which I really like, and I haven't seen it much in the US yet, but a simple thing of granting access to the trunk of your car so that you can have the dry cleaning picked up without, you know, worrying about the car being stolen. You know, a simple thing like that.
Or Amazon dropping in your car, Amazon shipping in your
Dropping
car.
something out. Or you know, if I were to want to share a car and with somebody else and ensure that they can't get into the glove box because that's where the registration is kept. Or, you know, basically limiting access to everything that the vehicle has to offer. And this is because it's API based and it's got some API calls that can be made, but you don't want, you know, somebody's application to be able to make all the API calls available. This is just classic access control and security. You want to be sure it's able to be done right, and somebody not being able to walk off or drive off with the car when it's no longer appropriate. And so there's just a million and one use cases like that where innovation gets sort of nipped in the bud because it's too hard to secure, it's too dangerous, and regulation tends to be very backward looking.
Eve, based on what the problems you just mentioned, which route do you recommend us to go?
Yeah, so one of the things that I've observed, largely Internet of Things security frameworks, well, they've made a little bit of progress in the last year, maybe the last 2 years. Oftentimes I see security frameworks and then I search for the word privacy in them, and most often the word privacy doesn't come up. So that's a bit of a concern. What's maybe interesting, maybe ironic, is that the web and API stack of security and access control and even consent standards is quite a bit more mature than the Internet of Things stack of frameworks. And when I look at what's been done in the area of API security, it's actually gotten really quite mature. So the OAuth standard is something that I think everybody should really be looking at a minimum, to be securing the APIs that are fronting all of these smart devices. Over the last couple of years, it's just been so frequent that you see this connected car, its security has been broken because, well, they didn't change the default password, they didn't secure their APIs at all. It's like, come on, people. Security hygiene first and foremost, but the OAuth technology, it's a standard. It's been a standard for a long time. It's been a very generative ecosystem of people working on it. There's a lot of enhancements that have been made to it. It's a must-do. So the next step is, as you look to solve increasing levels of use cases in these exciting new worlds of car sharing, as you were talking about, if this is a world where we're going to stop making as many cars and we're going to start leveraging vehicles that we have, I recommend looking at user-managed access, the UMA standard, which is built on top of OAuth. It enables sharing with an entirely third party, not just sharing with you yourself using an application to access an API, but sharing with somebody else. And so Alice can start sharing with Bob. And that is a use case that we see all the time with car sharing. And what's been done to date is implementing such functionality completely bespoke. And with standards, you can actually start to build bigger and bigger ecosystems. So I really recommend looking at this pretty well-known stack of security and privacy standards and identity standards that already exists. And then speaking of this identity relationship management proposition, when we're associating people and things, and we're associating a person with how many things are each of us going to have in our private stable, 7 to 10 to 50, and each thing is going to have how many sensors, and then we're going to start sharing with other people. We're talking about really complex networks, graphs really, of associations. And as I said, these associations have to be extremely dynamic and change in near real time. And so the IRM approach, in fact, really requires a graph database approach in order to scale and have the automation required to have a security approach, an access management approach that achieves the timeliness that we need. So that's what I really recommend.
Fascinating. That reminds me 10 years ago or 15 years ago, the problems that we saw, the security breaches, privacy problems that we saw in the internet sphere is coming back. Do you remember back in those days when you could you could actually import your buddy list by giving your username and password to Facebook from Google and many other MSN and many other ICQ and that kind of things? So there was no OAuth, there was no SAML, there was no UMA, and it started like this. And if I look at Automotive today, That reminds me of that. There is no standard protocol. Tier ones are inventing their challenge response protocol, and then OEMs are inventing their challenge response protocols. You're actually 10, 15 years back in time. Now, what I've seen is technology takes off exponentially. We've seen Moore's law even getting steeper and steeper in any technology. But privacy and security has always been slower, right? And in this particular case, when it comes to automotive, this can be fatal. You even talked about personal safety. So how should these things be paced up with such fast innovation?
Well, it's funny that what you're describing, that use case of putting in your username and password to a third-party service in order to do something where you are right now. It's known as the password anti-pattern. It's the thing you shouldn't do. And it's why OAuth was invented. ForgeRock is actually involved very heavily in automotive-grade Linux, AGL, and the reason is so that we can build in an identity and a strong authentication layer precisely to get things like the OAuth solutions, which were invented to do away with the password anti-pattern, baked right into that level of car ecosystem. So for starters, let's do that. It said you shouldn't develop security code, you should develop secure code, right? What that means is, don't invent your own crypto, use vetted crypto libraries, things like that. And I think the same thing is true of identity and authentication and authorization. Don't develop it from scratch. Use what's available that's been vetted. And that means using standards and using standard libraries. And so for starters, if you're in the business, look at AGL, look at the AGL distro and take advantage of it, for one. I mean, that would be a really good best practice because it's started to build in things that you can leverage that are already more secure and using the right design patterns and not the anti-patterns.
Fascinating. I'm going to move a little bit toward a particular unique kind of data that we have in automotive. We haven't seen it anywhere else. So when you drive a vehicle, you have tons of sensors, tons of data. In the car and vehicle structure, you don't even have the possibility to save all the data locally or in the back end. So I'm talking about your active suspension, your rain light sensor, and various kinds of data. So with these data, you could do probably a lot of predictions, a lot of innovation, a lot of functionality for the users. However, it's already challenging to send this data to the back end. We don't know how to do that yet. But at one point, the way technology is taken off, we'll be able to do that. This will be a unique kind of data. This is the kind of data those giant internet companies do not have access to. So we'll have a new kind of data that will be even more massive than anything happening in the web sphere. Will they be categorized as personal data, personally identifiable data? What do you think of that?
Well, if micro changes in tire pressure can identify somebody, then I have to think that some of it will be PII. And we probably don't know yet which will have consequences for personal identification, all of it. But we have to assume that almost all of it is personal data right now. The right way to bet is to assume that anything coming off of a car, any vehicle associated with a person, is personal data, and we should protect it as such. I think it's just the smart way to treat any kind of data. And then with 5G coming, unless you're really, really disconnected, there's certain scenarios where you're really disconnected. They don't call it urban mobility for nothing. If you're in an urban scenario, you're connected, and maybe if you're way out there, you're not very connected. But maybe a lot of these devices are just going to become their own hubs, their own gateways. I've been talking with a lot of people recently about that, and smart devices start to become less and less constrained, and they become their own, in OAuth terms, you'd call it a resource server. It starts to become that capable that it becomes sort of a fully fledged service in its own right, whatever kind of device it is. And at that point, you could start looking at it as having really direct analogs to this kind of web and API stack that I've been referring to that already has a fairly mature model, which will become really interesting. It'll be a kind of convergence, sort of IoT web API convergence, which would be really interesting.
Automotive, when it comes to autonomous vehicle, we have two challenges. On one hand, what you've mentioned, what we've been discussing till now, we have personally identifiable or personal data. On the other hand, the liability. Here, I must come up with a disclaimer where none of us are lawyers. When something happens in an autonomous vehicle, who's responsible? Definitely someone is not driving, so probably not the driver. Is it the OEM? Is it the tier 1 supplier who supplied the system? Or is it the tier 2 who may build the software? So there's a question of liability. And in order to track this liability, it is important also to gather these data. So that is a very important thing in autonomous vehicle. We'll have to gather these data. So I see somewhat a contradiction, somewhat a problem here. How do we reconcile that?
Yeah, it's, I'm not a lawyer, but I collect lawyers. Told a lot of people this. I actually literally do collect lawyers. There's a lot of visionary lawyers out there. And it gets really interesting when you look at that BLT sandwich. It's actually a lawyer who came up with that little phrase, one of the folks who's been involved in the UMA work. And it's why we actually developed an UMA business model. Because when you're talking a framework that has a notion of an authorization server that is separate from any number of resource servers, so hosts of data or APIs that let you do things at them, when you've got a notion of a resource owner, somebody who maybe owns a vehicle, sharing with somebody who's a requesting party, somebody who wants access to whatever the resource is, either because they want to put data into it or take data out of it, or because they want to drive the thing or be driven around in the thing. So now you've got a lot of parties. You've got operators of services, you've got people or companies, for that matter, who own or control a resource vehicle. And then you've got people or companies or organizations who want to, use the resource. So now you've got, you could have many a slip twixt cup and lip, as they say. A lot of things can go wrong. If you want to apportion liability, and this is for, my own personal data scenarios looking at UMA, but there's lots of circumstances in the world where you have to apportion liability. How do you figure out who was at fault if something really bad happens? And we know how bad really bad can get. And that's why we built this business model to say, we've got a protocol, we've got state changes, we can actually start to say, the state was thus and such, therefore, we can say, the operator of this service got this far, they did their job, the next guy down the chain didn't do their job. So in other words, we're actually mapping a protocol to responsible parties. And this could actually nicely map to things like smart contracts, if you want to get into, I haven't said the B word yet, there, I'll say it, blockchain. We don't have to, that's all kind of optional. But to map the workings of technology to the workings of the law and to contracts is something that I think is so important. And it turns out it's possible to do. In the case of the protocol that I've been working most closely with, we've done that mapping. And we're actually making it possible to do. It should be possible with every protocol. Think in terms of state changes and you start to get somewhere. So I don't have an answer for you unless I have a case in front of me and I'm not a lawyer, but I know the good ones.
Great. So we definitely have a lot to learn from the web sphere, from UMA, from other protocols that's there in the internet. The problem that is being an insider in automotive software development, automotive development, when it comes to a vehicle, you have an OEM, you have tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, you have around 3,000 parties involved, roughly 3,000 suppliers for a car. So we're talking about a scenario that is probably way more complex. The regular internet OAuth protocol or things like that are used.
Obviously, yeah. It's a number of protocols and it's a number of parts, and that's where the identities of those sensors and those devices starts to come in. I mean, it's complex no matter how you look at it. And that's why, I mean, I'm thinking of when we had the Challenger disaster, the space shuttle. And it's a terrible thing to bring up, but it took a year or something for them to actually figure out, that it was the O-ring that failed. It takes a long time to get down to what part failed, if that's what happened. And so there's no doubt in my mind that if something terrible happens, there has to be an investigation to just figure out what sensor, what part, what device, what physical thing may have been at fault. And then we get down to, oh, it wasn't a physical thing, it was software, or it was human error. There's a lot of squishiness in the world. So there is no doubt in my mind that, there's heuristics, there's guesses, there's percentages of possibility, and it's not going to be clean. But one of the things that we can start to simplify is there are technological roadways, so to speak, in there that we can start to make auditable, so that we start to have some proof of what did happen in those messages. And that can start to clarify what happened. And that's actually helpful as well for the question of what happened with the personal data.
So Eve, so all these challenges that we talked about, we also talked about opportunities, innovations. So let's end with a positive note. In your opinion, in the coming years, with autonomous vehicle being reality, massive data sharing, massive amount of innovation, what would be, in your opinion, the most positive things that would be coming up in the next few years?
Well, I see opportunities for people to leverage the things they have more fully. I see them taking advantage of their vehicles more fully for more uses and letting others who they care about use them, and maybe making money off of them, and having a more convenient lifestyle. I'm actually seeing that in some of the work we do with, there's a sports company that we work with that makes all kinds of sports equipment. And they've been discovering the same thing that I think we're seeing in the sharing economy for vehicles, which is that people don't necessarily want to buy skis that sit in their garage, most of the season. They want to maybe have more of a sharing economy for skis. So why not for vehicles, which are more expensive, more complex? And I really see that becoming much more of the case in the future. And it absolutely depends on people being in control of data sharing. That's at the heart of their being able to live that future.
I love that. So people being in control and being the heart of data sharing in vehicle sharing in autonomous settings. So Eve, thank you very much for joining. It was a pleasure having you.
It was a pleasure being with you today. Thanks.
In this podcast show, we bring in the industry leaders and experts in the automotive domain to share their experiences along their journey. The mission of our podcast is to start a dialogue that will allow us to understand the development of automotive industry and where the automotive industry is going. You can ask questions to our guests directly. Just send us an email to podcast@matrix.de. We'll schedule a call with you during the recording and you'll be part of our show. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure you subscribe so that you don't miss any new episodes. Please share this video to help others get enlightened as well, and that would mean a great deal to us. See you in the next episode.